The case of the Emerald Brooch. The insistent rapping at our door on a particularly blustery Tuesday morning was as sharp and unexpected as a clap of thunder. I, Dr. John Watson, was engrossed in a somewhat morbid article in The Lancet when Holmes, who had been brooding over a chemical retort with an almost unnatural intensity, merely grunted his assent. Our visitor, ushered in by Mrs. Hudson, proved to be a young woman of perhaps 25, plainly dressed, yet with an air of refined distress that immediately caught my attention. Her name, she tearfully informed us, was Miss Eleanor Vance, and her plight, she assured us, was desperate. "Mr. Holmes," she began, twisting a damp handkerchief in her hands, "I've come all the way from Kent. Something truly dreadful has occurred at Blackwood Manor, and I fear there's no logical explanation." Holmes, now abandoning his experiment, gestured for her to take the worn armchair opposite him. His keen gray eyes, normally alight with a restless intellect, were now fixed upon her with a singular, dissecting gaze. "Pray, elaborate, Miss Vance," he intoned, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "Logic, you will find, is often merely observation applied with a degree of precision." Miss Vance took a shaky breath. "I am a governess, Mr. Holmes, in the employ of Lady Ashworth at Blackwood Manor. It's a grand, albeit rather isolated estate near Tunbridge Wells. Lady Ashworth is particular, and she possesses a collection of jewels, among them a truly magnificent emerald brooch. It's an heirloom, generations old, and she values it above all her other possessions." "And the brooch has vanished?" Holmes interjected, already formulating possibilities. "Precisely, this morning. But that's not even the most perplexing part. It disappeared from its display case, which was not only locked, but within Lady Ashworth's personal sitting room, a room that itself was locked from the inside. There are no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no disturbances whatsoever. It's as if it simply melted away." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, a familiar thrill of a fresh mystery beginning to stir within me. A locked room disappearance was precisely the kind of Gordian knot Holmes delighted in untangling. "Tell me, Miss Vance," Holmes continued, leaning forward, "who else was present at Blackwood Manor last night? Who had access, however remote, to the sitting room or to the keys?" "Only Lady Ashworth, of course," she replied, "and myself. Then there is Lord Ashworth, Lady Ashworth's nephew, who arrived a few days ago for a visit. He's a charming man, but, well, he has a reputation for being rather free with money, if you understand my meaning." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with casting suspicion. "I understand perfectly, Miss Vance. And the staff?" "Only the most trusted," she affirmed. "Bartholomew Croft, the butler. He's been with the family for 40 years, utterly beyond reproach. And Mrs. Gable, the cook. She's a formidable woman, sharp as a tack, but fiercely loyal to Lady Ashworth. Beyond them, no one else was in the house. The other servants, the maids and footmen, were all in their respective quarters, which are quite separate from the main house after hours." "And the brooch's display case," Holmes pressed. "Describe it precisely. Its construction, the lock, its usual placement." "It's a heavy oak case with a glass top, quite old-fashioned. The lock is a rather intricate brass mechanism. Lady Ashworth always kept the key herself, on a chain around her neck. The case sits on a small table by the window in her sitting room. She had admired the brooch just yesterday evening before retiring, and I saw it there myself. This morning, when she went to retrieve it for a special occasion, it was simply gone. The case was still locked, Mr. Holmes, still locked." Her voice rose in pitch, reflecting the sheer impossibility of the situation. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment, a familiar sign that his colossal brain was already at work, sifting through the initial facts, discarding the irrelevant, and isolating the truly significant. "Miss Vance," he said, opening his eyes, now gleaming with an almost predatory interest, "I believe Dr. Watson and I must pay a visit to Blackwood Manor without delay. A mystery of this nature demands immediate attention. Kindly telegraph ahead, if you would, and inform Lady Ashworth of our impending arrival. We shall take the next available train to Tunbridge Wells." As Miss Vance, with a renewed glimmer of hope in her eyes, departed to send the telegram, I turned to Holmes, a question already forming on my lips. A locked case within a locked room, Holmes? No forced entry? This smacks of the supernatural, or a trick of the most ingenious kind. Holmes smiled, a rare and fleeting expression that always sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. The supernatural, my dear Watson, is merely the natural that we have yet to comprehend. And as for ingenuity, we shall soon see whose intellect is superior, the perpetrators or ours. Fetch your coat, my friend. The game, as they say, is afoot. Arrival at Blackwood Manor. The journey to Tunbridge Wells was swift, though punctuated by Holmes's customary silence, a sure sign that his mind was already grappling with the intricacies of the case. I, meanwhile, occupied myself with theories, each more elaborate than the last, and all no doubt far from the mark. Blackwood Manor proved to be a formidable Victorian edifice, its dark brick facade partially obscured by ancient ivy, lending it an air of somber grandeur. We were met at the imposing oak door by Bartholomew Croft, the butler Miss Vance had described. He was a man of advanced years, ramrod straight, with a face etched by decades of dutiful service. His eyes, though weary, held a quiet dignity. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, his voice a low, measured rumble. "Miss Vance has apprised Lady Ashworth of your arrival. She awaits you in the drawing room." He led us through a dimly lit hallway, past ancestral portraits that seemed to watch us with silent disapproval, and into a drawing room furnished with heavy, dark wood and rich, faded tapestries. Seated by the cold hearth was Lady Ashworth herself, muzzle bade inset as to prove by Buthly Ashworth animo. Aver. She was a woman of formidable presence, her hair drawn back in a severe bun, her features sharp and unyielding even in distress. Her eyes, though clouded with worry, held a piercing intelligence. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice crisp, "Miss Vance has explained the rather unbelievable circumstances. I confess I am at a loss. That brooch has been in my family for generations. It is irreplaceable, not merely for its monetary value, but for the history it embodies." "I assure you, Lady Ashworth," Holmes replied, his tone respectful yet firm, "there is always an explanation, however improbable it may appear. Perhaps you could begin by describing the room where the brooch was kept and the events leading up to its discovery." Lady Ashworth nodded, her gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. "The brooch was in a display case in my private sitting room. It's at the end of the west wing, a quiet room I use for correspondence and contemplation. Last night, as has been my habit for years, I removed the brooch from the safe, admired it for a few moments, and placed it back in its case on the small table by the window. I then locked the case, as always, with the key I keep on a chain around my neck. I then locked the sitting room door from the inside, extinguished the lamp, and retired to my bedroom directly across the hall. This morning, when I returned to retrieve the brooch, the case was still locked, the room was still locked, but the brooch was gone." "And the key to the sitting room door, Lady Ashworth?" Holmes inquired. "Always on the same chain as the brooch key," she replied, a faint tremor in her voice. "It never leaves my person, not even while I sleep. I am a creature of habit, Mr. Holmes." Initial observations and suspects. Holmes requested to see the sitting room immediately. It was indeed a testament to Lady Ashworth's meticulous nature. Every cushion plumped, every book precisely aligned. The display case, a heavy oak box with a glass top, sat exactly as described. Holmes circled it slowly, his eyes missing nothing. He knelt, examining the brass lock with a small magnifying glass, then ran his gloved fingers along the edges of the glass and the seams of the wood. "No visible forcing here," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "And the room's windows?" "Latched from the inside, Mr. Holmes," Croft supplied from the doorway. "And they are quite high above the ground. Even a seasoned climber would struggle without a ladder." Holmes checked the windows himself, then the fireplace, running his fingers up the chimney. "No entry or exit here, Watson," he confirmed, rising. "This is indeed a curious paradox." Our next interview was with Lord Ashworth, Lady Ashworth's nephew. He entered the drawing room with an easy, almost too charming smile, dressed in impeccable tweed. He was a man of slight build, with restless eyes that seemed to dart about the room, taking everything in. "A dreadful business, Mr. Holmes," he declared, affecting an air of sincere concern. "A family tragedy, really. Poor Aunt Agatha is quite beside herself. The brooch, you see, meant a great deal to her." "Indeed," Holmes said, fixing him with his penetrating gaze. "And where were you, Lord Ashworth, at the time the brooch is presumed to have vanished?" Lord Ashworth gave a light, dismissive shrug. "Oh, much the same as usual. I had dinner with Aunt Agatha, then retired to my room in the East Wing. A bit of light reading, perhaps a glass of port. I was asleep by 11, I should think. Didn't hear a thing." "You are aware of your aunt's habits regarding the brooch, I presume?" Holmes asked casually. A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed Lord Ashworth's face. "One couldn't help but be aware. It was her prized possession. A shame it's gone. Though, if I'm honest, it often struck me as rather gaudy. Far too much emerald, don't you think? A bit ostentatious." His smile returned a little too quickly. Holmes merely nodded, offering no comment, but I knew he had filed away the nephew's casual disparagement of an heirloom he should, by all rights, have held in high regard. Our final interviews were with the staff. Mrs. Gable, the cook, was a formidable woman, as Miss Vance had indicated, with arms like hams and an apron perpetually dusted with flour. She eyed Holmes with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. "Disappeared, you say?" she scoffed, hands on her ample hips. "Nonsense. Jewels don't just disappear. Someone took it. And if you ask me, there aren't many in this house who wouldn't fancy a bit of extra coin, even if they pretend otherwise." Her gaze briefly, pointedly, flickered towards the doorway where Lord Ashworth had recently exited. Holmes merely observed, allowing her to speak her mind. "And Mr. Croft, the butler?" Croft, when questioned, was impeccably formal and precise. He recounted his duties the previous evening with meticulous detail, confirming that all doors and windows in his charge were secured. He expressed profound distress at the incident, describing it as a stain upon the manor's honor. "Are you aware of any strained relationships within the household, Mr. Croft?" Holmes pressed. Croft hesitated, his eyes briefly meeting mine before returning to Holmes's unblinking stare. "This household, Mr. Holmes, is much like any other. Minor disagreements, perhaps, but nothing, I assure you, that would lead to such an act of larceny." Holmes thanked him, and as Croft bowed slightly and exited, Holmes turned to me, a peculiar glint in his eye. "An interesting tableau, Watson. The distressed owner, the charming but impecunious nephew, the loyal but taciturn butler, and the outspoken cook, each with their own secrets, no doubt, but the question remains, how was the brooch spirited away from a locked case in a locked room?" He pulled out his pipe, his gaze drifting towards the window where the first tendrils of a familiar London fog were beginning to creep across the stately grounds of Blackwood Manor. Holmes's method and a suspicious observation. Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon immersing himself in Blackwood Manor. He eschewed the grand drawing room for the servants' quarters, much to Croft's visible bewilderment and Mrs. Gable's grudging fascination. He examined the household's routines, questioned the maids about their cleaning schedule, and even inquired about the deliveries from the local village. He paid particular attention to the dimensions of the windows, the thickness of the walls, and the state of the various locks throughout the house. "The key to understanding a house, Watson," he remarked as we walked along a drafty corridor, "is to understand its arteries. The passages, the service stairs, the connections between rooms. A house, like a human body, has its own circulatory system, and a skilled criminal knows how to exploit its weaknesses." He returned repeatedly to Lady Ashworth's sitting room, examining the small table where the brooch case rested. He carefully measured the distance from the table to the windows, the height of the windows themselves, and even the patterns of dust on the floorboards around the case. He produced a small, leather-bound notebook and sketched the room, marking points with precise crosses. "Remarkable, isn't it, Watson?" he mused, without looking up from his sketch. "How something so valuable can simply vanish without a trace. No forced lock, no broken glass, no sign of tampering. Lady Ashworth is adamant the room was locked from the inside and she held the only key." "Perhaps the key was duplicated?" I suggested, ever the pragmatist. Holmes shook his head. "A possibility, but the complexity of Victorian lock mechanisms often made amateur duplication difficult. And consider the lack of disturbance. A duplicated key still requires physical entry. No, this suggests something far more elegant." He then did something peculiar. He requested a basin of water and a bar of soap. To my surprise, he carefully washed down the top surface of the display case, not to clean it, but to observe how the water beaded and ran off, and how quickly it dried. He then examined the surface again with his magnifying glass, paying close attention to minute scratches and imperfections. As dusk settled, painting the manor's ancient windows in hues of orange and purple, Holmes concluded his initial inspection. We found ourselves once more in the drawing room, where Lady Ashworth sat, a picture of aristocratic despondency. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice strained, "have you found anything? Any glimmer of hope?" "A few interesting observations, Lady Ashworth," Holmes replied cryptically. "I confess, the situation presents a fascinating challenge. Tell me, do you ever leave the brooch in the case unlocked during the day?" "Never," she asserted, her eyes widening. "I am a creature of habit, as I said. Always locked, always." "Indeed. And how often do you clean the display case, Lady Ashworth?" "The night watch, and the subtle clue." True to his word, Holmes retired early that evening, though I knew his mind would be far from sleep. He left me with a cryptic instruction. "Observe the patterns, Watson, the rhythms of the house. Even in stillness there is movement." I spent a restless night. The old manor creaked and groaned with the settling of timbers, and the wind, still blustery, sighed mournfully around the eaves. My thoughts drifted to the various suspects: the imperious Lady Ashworth, the charming but debt-ridden nephew, the fiercely loyal butler, the sharp-tongued cook, and even the distressed governess, Miss Vance, whose tears might have been a performance. Each seemed to fit a piece of the puzzle, yet none provided the complete picture. How could a brooch vanish from a locked case in a locked room? The sheer audacity of the feat continued to confound me. I drifted into a light sleep, only to be roused by the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor outside our rooms. I heard Holmes's door creak open and then close softly. Peeking out, I saw his tall, lean figure silhouetted against the dim moonlight filtering through a distant window. He was moving silently, a small lantern clutched in one hand. Without a second thought, I slipped out of my own room and followed, keeping a discreet distance. Holmes made his way to Lady Ashworth's sitting room. The door, naturally, was locked. He produced a small set of delicate picks from his waistcoat pocket, and with an almost imperceptible click, the lock yielded. He entered, and I followed, careful not to disturb the silence. The room was bathed in shadows, save for the narrow beam of Holmes's lantern. He did not go to the display case immediately. Instead, he knelt by the fireplace, examining the cold ashes, then moved to the windows, running his fingers along the sills. Finally, he turned to the display case itself. He did not touch the case or the lock. Instead, he carefully slid a thin, flexible piece of wire, no thicker than a human hair, into the minute gap between the glass lid and the wooden frame of the case. He moved it slowly, meticulously, along the entire perimeter. Then he held the wire up to the faint light of his lantern, his eyes narrowing. "As I suspected, Watson," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "the solution lies not in brute force, nor in a duplicated key, but in a far more subtle understanding of mechanics and of human nature." He then performed another peculiar action. He took a small vial from his pocket, opened it, and gently poured a fine, almost invisible powder onto the surface of the display case. He waited a moment, then carefully brushed it away with a soft camel hair brush. As he did so, Faint, ethereal patterns began to emerge on the glass, smudges, streaks, and peculiar, almost crystalline marks. "Observe something, Holmes?" I whispered, my heart thudding with anticipation. "Indeed, my dear fellow. Allah, the unique signature of our thief. Come, let us return. We have our answer and our culprit." The revelation. The following morning, after a breakfast of surprisingly robust tea and indifferent toast, Holmes gathered Lady Ashworth, Lord Ashworth, Bartholomew Croft, Mrs. Gable, and a rather anxious Miss Vance in the drawing room. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Holmes stood before them, radiating an almost palpable authority. His eyes, now bright with the thrill of the chase concluded, swept over each face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and deliberate, "the case of the vanished emerald brooch from a locked case in a locked room has presented a fascinating study in apparent impossibility. However, as I have often remarked, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "The key to this mystery lies in two deceptively simple facts: the nature of the display case and the locked state of the room." He turned to Lady Ashworth. "Lady Ashworth, you stated that the key to the sitting room door never leaves your person. This is crucial. It confirms that no one entered or exited the room by conventional means after you locked it from the inside." Lady Ashworth nodded, looking bewildered. "But then how—" "Precisely," Holmes continued. "The room was indeed locked, but the lock, Lady Ashworth, was compromised. Not by force, not by a duplicated key, but by an ingenious, almost imperceptible manipulation. This manor, though outwardly grand, is old, and old buildings, like old habits, often have small vulnerabilities." He turned to Croft. "Mr. Croft, you are a meticulous man, loyal to the manor. Tell me, have the frames of the doors and windows warped at all over the years? Perhaps a slight shift in the foundation?" Croft hesitated, his eyes wide. "Well, sir, the house does settle. The sitting room door in particular sometimes sticks." "Indeed," Holmes said with a slight smile. "It sticks in such a way, I discovered last night, that if one were to exert just the right amount of pressure on the door frame, the bolt, while appearing to be fully engaged, would actually slip back just enough to allow the door to be opened with minimal force and then relocked from the outside, leaving no trace." A gasp went through the room. Lord Ashworth looked particularly pale. "But that still leaves the display case, Mr. Holmes," I interjected. "That was locked, and the key was on Lady Ashworth's chain." "Ah, the emerald brooch itself," Holmes said, his gaze settling on Miss Eleanor Vance. The young governess, who had been listening with a mixture of hope and fear, now looked as if she had seen a ghost. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. "The display case," Holmes continued, his voice dropping slightly, "is old. The glass top, while seemingly secure, had a minute, almost invisible gap along its front edge. A gap caused by time and perhaps a subtle, repeated stress." He held up the thin wire he had used the previous night. "This wire, tipped with a minute amount of a powerful adhesive, could be inserted through this gap. With remarkable dexterity, it could then be maneuvered to adhere to the surface of the brooch. Then, with careful, patient extraction, the brooch itself could be lifted directly through the gap, leaving the lock undisturbed and the glass intact." A silence, thick and heavy, descended upon the room. All eyes were now on Miss Vance. "And the specific crystalline marks I found on the glass surface this morning, after applying a detection powder," Holmes concluded, his voice unwavering, "are the unmistakable residue of the adhesive. An adhesive, I might add, that contains a rare chemical compound often used in the treatment of fine textiles. A compound, Miss Vance, that would be found in the possession of someone who handles delicate fabrics, perhaps for needlework or the mending of precious garments." Miss Vance let out a small, strangled sob. Her composure, which had held so bravely through her initial appeal, now shattered completely. She sank onto a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. I... I didn't mean to," she stammered between sobs. "Lady Ashworth, she withheld my wages. My mother is ill, gravely ill, and I needed the money for her medicine. Lord Ashworth, he promised to help, but he only ever asked me for money. I saw the brooch. It was so beautiful, so valuable. I saw an opportunity. I studied Lady Ashworth's habits. I saw how the door sometimes shifted. And the case, I noticed the tiny gap when I was dusting it. I used a needle, a strong silk thread, and a special resin I use for mending antique lace." Lady Ashworth gasped, clutching her chest. Lord Ashworth, who had looked relieved at the initial misdirection, now looked utterly mortified. Croft and Mrs. Gable exchanged grim, knowing glances. "You borrowed from the very fine tapestry mending kit I keep in the drawing room," Lady Ashworth finally managed, her voice barely a whisper, not of anger but of profound shock. "Yes, my lady," Miss Vance choked out. "I am so sorry, I truly am." Holmes stepped forward, his expression grave. "Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, Miss Vance. Your method was indeed ingenious, born of desperation. However, ingenuity in crime, while admirable in its execution, cannot excuse the act itself." He turned to Lady Ashworth. "The decision of how to proceed with Miss Vance, of course, rests entirely with you. But the mystery of the vanished emerald brooch, I believe, is now quite clear." Lady Ashworth, after a long, anguished silence, looked at the trembling governess, then at the assembled faces. Her stern features softened, imperceptibly at first, then with a clear flicker of human understanding. "You say your mother is ill, Miss Vance?" she asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Why did you not come to me?" Miss Vance could only weep, unable to articulate the shame and fear that had driven her. "Regardless of how this unfortunate affair is resolved," Holmes concluded, retrieving his hat and coat, "Dr. Watson and I have completed our task. We have found the brooch, or at least the truth of its disappearance." As we prepared to leave Blackwood Manor, I watched Lady Ashworth approach Miss Vance, her hand hesitantly reaching out. The precise outcome of the governess's fate remained uncertain, but Holmes had once again peeled back the layers of deception, revealing not only the cunning of the criminal, but the complex, often desperate motivations that lay beneath. Another case closed, another paradox resolved, and the great detective's reputation, if possible, only further solidified.